Hello and welcome back into Slick Talk. This is your host, Blackstone Joe. Today we have an exciting episode for you on Nissan CVTs, the NS-2 and NS-3 fluid they're supposed to be using, why it's problematic not to have that fluid in place, and how we can help you find out if your Nissan CVT is in fact running the correct fluid. Before we get going though, I wanted to thank everyone who tuned into episode 17 titled Looking Back, Moving Forward. If you haven't listened yet, we delved into the history of used oil analysis, stopping about the 1980s because 85 is when Blackstone really entered the picture, and we of course want to do a deep dive into our own history. And so we are going to continue this series. In fact, next episode we will be digging into a specific test, how we run it, where it came from, the significance of it. But stay tuned till the end of the episode to find out more about it. For now though, today's episode, we have another catch pan segment to get going, and then we're also going to dig into, as we mentioned earlier, Nissan CVTs. So Nissan CVT transmissions, even if you're well read into the problems they can have if the wrong fluid is in use, I think this episode will still give you a lot of insight into the tests we run and how they can indicate if the correct oil is in use. So without further ado, let's get into the show. Before we dig into the topic, we do have a brief catch pan segment. We had a question come in from YouTube account Jack of All Trades. This question came in on our last episode, episode 17. So this person asks, thoughts on manufacturers such as Honda trying to use 0.16 oil to try to lessen the oil dilution issue in the GDI turbo engines. So this is interesting. It's news to me if this is the case. I haven't seen 0.16 samples in Honda engines particularly, or just, GDI engines in general. So if this is indeed some sort of corrective measure, that's going to be interesting to see play out. I will actually, later on today, I'm going to go ahead and dig into our files and see if we do have any 0.16 samples laying around. It's possible we do, and it's also possible that if we do have any, sometimes folks might not mention that, hey, I'm running 0.16 because Honda is trying to correct this issue. So there could be a couple of blanks to fill in, but this does give me something interesting to dig into on my end, and I will return to the next episode with any findings I have as far as if 0.16 is becoming a trend as far as the samples we've seen or not. That would be interesting though. We do still get a lot of samples from, not just Honda, but turbocharged engines, gasoline, direct inject engines, people who are trying to monitor fuel dilution closely. So it's certainly still a big topic on our end. And so too are Nissan CVT samples. Okay, so I want to switch gears to this. I think a lot of people can relate to this kind of scenario. You're getting ready to buy a car, and maybe you're concerned about the right oil, the right transmission fluid, everything that the car is supposed to be running. You want to make sure that's correct. And when you don't have a laboratory at your side, and you're pressed for time, and you just need some assurances, maybe some paperwork, something, sometimes the salesperson is only in a position to just give you a visual representation. And when it comes to engine oil, that's just not terribly helpful. But in this case, the salesperson in question thought that was all they needed. So here's the layout of this particular story. We're in a dealership parking lot when this story takes place, okay? Person A has, if not bought the car, they're very close. The price is agreed upon, paperwork might not be signed, but it's prepared. Salesperson takes person A out into the parking lot, takes them up to the car, pops the hood, and they want to show that the correct oil is in use. So they pull the dipstick out, take one look at it, and go, ah, yes, that's a full synthetic right there. replace the dipstick, close the hood, hands on the hips, looking very accomplished. But person A happened to be a data analyst working at Blackstone. Not me, but this story is one that's floated around the building because it's fun for us. It's fun when we go out into the wild and we're buying a car, or we are, in any sort of setting where our expertise might be a little hidden, and we get to hear someone either tell us how good they are at identifying a synthetic or a conventional based off sight alone, which is just, it's kind of interesting. When it comes to engine oil, again, this is a point we've harped on in the past. Looks can be deceiving, very deceiving for engine oil. But when you dig into transmission oil, it's a little bit different. So CVT transmissions, the oil matters a lot, what you're using, because these are very, very intricate machines. I don't know if anyone listening has torn into a CVT themselves. If you have, we'd love to hear about it. Mention that in the comments. CVTs are complex, and the oil passages, when you take these things apart, it looks like this incredible maze. And you can kind of appreciate the fact that there's a lot of engineering going into these, and you can understand that the fluid type would matter quite a bit. Because this isn't some splash lubrication system where the specific oil in place is serving a very basic purpose. That's just not what's going on with these. So NS-2, NS-3. These are a couple of Nissan approved oils for CVT transmissions. And in this case, color can be a pretty clear indicator. In fact, if the color of the fluid is red, then that's almost always indicative of ATF being in use. I had a customer call one day and they mentioned that their tech, whoever was performing the oil change, said, yep, that fluid's going to change red due to oxidation. Well, that's not true. And I feel bad for however many people have been told statements like that, especially when it comes to CVTs, because here's the deal. When you have the wrong fluid in these things, people will report to us almost instantaneous operational issues. Maybe some of this is a little psychosomatic, but I do tend to believe, though, that the wrong oil being in use will affect these pretty much right off the bat. People will report issues with slipping or just rough operation in general. So it's certainly something that we have come across a lot, to the point where, we have a firm understanding of what NS2 fluid and NS3 fluid looks like. Now, these fluids will normally darken up just as a result of doing their job. So if you have an NS2 or an NS3 and the fluids start out as green or blue, as those fluids typically do, if it turns black, then that's not an indicator that the fluid broke down or that it was incorrect from the get-go. Dark color alone, we're going to put that to the side, because any fluid, engine oil, ATF, CVT, as it's doing its job, there will be a darkening that occurs. But you should never see a red color. And when we're looking at the color, we'll then move on to something also very definitive as far as if it's the wrong fluid, and that will be additive levels. We're going to look at these in the spectral analysis, and we're going to see how these additive levels look in relation to one another. How is the balance? Are the levels indicative of NS2 or NS3? And if we can put the color and the additive levels together, that's a pretty good indication of whether or not the right fluid is in use. But we're not going to stop there, okay? So say you do have the wrong fluid in use, it's not an immediate death sentence for the transmission, okay? So we're going to look at how that fluid has been treating the transmission, and we're going to look at that in a couple of areas. So wear metals and insolubles. So do we have a lot of high wear? Do we have a lot of solid material? Okay, because if you have a lot of solid material, those are insolubles, then that can be a result of rapid oxidation from having the wrong fluid in use. And if you have high metals, then that can suggest some poor wear from the fluid not treating the transmission properly. But there are a couple things we always want to have on hand as well. That's a rough idea of service history. So transmissions tend to not have very many oil changes under their belt when they come our way. So we want to know exactly, is this the factory oil? Is it the second, third oil change? Bring that information to the table if you can, because if we do have high metals, it's not necessarily poor wear. It can also be wear in. And that way you can proceed with having some idea of the transmission's condition from a wear standpoint. We can also look at how the fluid did from an oxidation standpoint. If we find a lot of oxidized solids, then that can also contribute to high wear. So we're going to, as always, we're going to take the whole report and gauge the health of the transmission regardless of the right or wrong fluid being in use. And that can kind of give you a plan to proceed from there. So if you are buying a Nissan and it has a CVT transmission and you want to know if the right oil is in use, you're in luck, because we've not only seen a lot of CVT samples, but we also have a number of unused samples on hand for reference. It's not the case for every transmission type, though, simply because we don't get the interest that comes with CVTs with every other model. So we're not the kind of research laboratory that's just going to have every single fluid type that comes on the market to have virgin samples on hand. But if folks want to send those in, that will offer a direct comparison. And you can also give us a call, email ahead of time, and ask us what our familiarity is with a certain fluid type. And that way we can at least dig through the files and let you know if we have seen that fluid before. But if not, an unused sample can go a long ways in helping you out. So that's really for cases outside of a Nissan CVT, just in case anyone's listening who has a different kind of transmission and maybe they've heard similar issues have cropped up as far as having the wrong oil in use. So if you're a customer who is looking to check on their CVT transmission, or if you're about to buy a car with a CVT transmission and you have any questions at all about the fluid and whether or not you have the right fluid in place, we can definitely help. So feel free to send those samples in. Before we let you go, though, we do have a couple pieces of news and notes. One of them being Slick Talk is slowly going to build an apparel stockpile, and we're going to start with shirts. So we are in the stages of getting some designs put together, and if you have any interest in those, sound off below in the comments if you're listening on YouTube, or you can send us a message on Facebook or email. You can get yourself on a sort of pre-order list, so to speak, and we can start getting some orders put together. Designs will be released on our social media account coming up, especially on our Instagram. You'll probably see some posts make their way to Facebook as well, but we'd love to gauge a little bit of customer interest in that area, so we're excited to bring those to you as well. As far as future episodes, we're going to keep building on the history of used oil analysis. I mentioned we're going to be digging into Blackstone history in particular, but we're also going to look at certain tests that we run, where they came from, how they originated, and the next one will be on the flashpoint test. That is how we find fuel. So it'll be interesting to revisit that topic about Hondas and 016 and whether or not that's a measure being used to correct fuel in those engines. I'm not sure on that yet, but it's going to be something interesting to do a deep dive into. But also, this flashpoint episode will give you a lot of insight as to how fuel shows up, how we test for it, what the machinery is like, what is the lab setup like, where did those tests originate from, so on and so forth. So we're excited to bring that to you. Meanwhile, if you have any interesting insight into Nissan CVTs, if you've had your own experiences with them, we'd love to hear about that as well. So feel free to send them our way. If you have any catchpan questions at all, though, we encourage those too. We'd love to feature them on the next episode. But for now, that brings episode 18 to a close. This is Blackstone Joe signing off.